How to do a burr-to-burr incision. But first, what is a burr-to-burr incision and why would you want to use this method? A burr-to-burr incision, as the name suggests, is an incision from the burr to the burr, and that's it. This method is different than a Y cut, a T cut, 7 cut, long cut, short cuts, because it only has one simple cut. Basically, burr-to-burr cuts eliminate a lot of seam and they eliminate a lot of sewing. A pretty big reason for using a burr-to-burr incision is if you're going to be doing any kind of taxidermy competitions and competing, I highly recommend using a burr-to-burr incision because a judge, when they judge your mount, is going to, number one, look for the seam, and they're also going to feel to see if they can feel the seam. So if you have no stitching, then they're obviously not going to feel that. And you might be thinking, well, I'm a great sewer. I have no problem just sewing up the back of the incisions, whatever. Well, even the best sewers in the world aren't going to be able to be as good as the lack of seam. So even if you don't use this method for your everyday mounts, it is good to know how to do this in case you ever do want to compete, because again, I highly recommend it for taxidermy competitions. One more great reason to use a burr-to-burr incision is that when you mount with a deer cape that has a burr-to-burr incision, it is going to fit so well around the head. All your hair patterns are going to be automatically in place and everything just fits so seamlessly. And also it could save you some time because all you have to do is just sew from here to here. You don't have to sew any more length than that. Sometimes fitting and test fitting can be a little bit trickier because you don't have any relief cuts, but with a good fitting form and cape, you should have no problem. One more quick reason this method is also great on early season capes, any kind of velvet animals, because sometimes they just have almost no hair on the back of their heads. And so obviously you would see some kind of seam line, some kind of stitching, but with a burr-to-burr, you eliminate all that. So now that the explanation's out of the way, let's get going on the burr-to-burr. Doing a burr-to-burr incision is similar to any other type of incision, and you're going to do it pretty much the same way as you would cape out any other type of deer. However, you do need one more tool, and that's the multi-tool. And I'll show you what we do with this later. You're going to need a scalpel. I like using a number 11 scalpel, and it's a number 3 handle. I like this one because it's small and it has the point on it. Optionally, you can use a screwdriver and a hammer to help get that skin off from around the burrs. And obviously you're going to need a deer head. So now I just start skinning the head out like I normally do, and I always start from the front. While I normally stop right about here when I'm skinning from the nose down, I'm actually going to try to go even deeper and try to just dislodge some of that skin from the skull. I just want to get as much relief as possible going into the incision on the back. Now moving on to the top of the deer head, and we're going to start the incision. For a burr-to-burr incision, you want to make your cut on the top of the head. What I like to do is take the point of my scalpel and poke it in right underneath the burr where the burr and the skin meet. Then I start to slowly cut the skin while I'm also rotating the scalpel so that the sharp side is now facing up. You'll want to do it this way so that you're cutting the skin from underneath, as opposed to cutting from the outside, because you'll probably cut hair doing that. So if you cut from the underside, you ensure that you're not going to cut any hair. So now you can really see where that incision is going to be. And when I lay the hair flat like this, you can really see that this is going to hide really well. And so this right here is the only cuts we're going to make on the skin. The rest of the cuts we're going to make are just releasing that skin from underneath the burrs. Cutting the skin away from the burrs or releasing the skin away from the burrs is hard even when you're not doing a burr-to-burr cut. So take your time and do a perfect job. You don't want to leave any skin or hair left under the burrs. Releasing the skin away from the burrs is one of the reasons that I like using a number 11 scalpel as opposed to bigger scalpels, because I feel like I can really get in there underneath the burrs and release the skin without cutting any of the skin or hair. The back side of the burrs is going to be the hardest because there is no relief cuts like you would normally have with like a Y or a T cut. So just remember to take your time, do it slow, and do it right. This is where the flathead screwdriver and the hammer comes in handy. If you wedge that screwdriver underneath the skin and gently tap it with the hammer, you can release that skin without having to cut the membrane underneath. A lot of times when I'm skinning out heads, I'll just use a scalpel, but because we're doing a burr-to-burr incision and things are just a little bit tighter and I'm trying to get this perfect, I am going to use the screwdriver and hammer as well as the scalpel to just release the skin. So now you can see that I've completely separated the skin from underneath the burrs, and I've done this on both sides. But just because they're completely separated doesn't mean the skull plate's ready to be cut off yet. I'm going to take just my scalpel now, and I'm going to skin down as far as I possibly can go. You can see like exactly here, there's some membrane that still could be cut. So I'm going to try to release the skin as much as possible now. This is really going to be important when we go to cut the skull plate off. You'll want as much wiggle room as possible underneath this skin. So now here you can see there's just a lot more room to work with. I skinned out the entire forehead, and there's a lot more room around the underside of the burrs. So now this is the fun part where we're going to use the multi-tool, and I'm going to cut the skull cap just like I normally would if I was using a sawzall, but obviously being careful of the skin that's still attached to the skull. I'm going to start by cutting on the forehead first, and then I'm going to cut behind the antlers. This does take a little bit of maneuvering, a little bit of patience, but we'll cut through it, and I'll show you how that looks after I'm done with this cut. So as you can see here, I'm literally just cutting into the skull plate like I normally would if I was using the sawzall, and because the multi-tool blade is so small, you do have to make numerous cuts. How I'm doing this is that I'm holding the multi-tool with one hand, and the other hand I'm using to hold the skin back. So now here's the first complete forehead cut, and I may have to come back and touch it up later, but this is what we're going for. The back of this head is going to be a little bit harder than the front. So if you need to, you can take your multi-tool, set it in like the safety position, which is right in the middle, and then you can literally pop this out and move your blade to the side if you need to, a slightly offset angle. You know, if that makes it easier to get into those tough angles, you can do that. For now, I'm going to leave it just in the normal position and see how that works, but if I need to change it later, I will. So now I'm going to cut the skull right behind the burrs. I just want to add that when I'm making these cuts, I'm doing it at kind of an angle so that I'm making kind of a V cut with the skull plate. They're not straight down, straight 90-degree cuts. It's going to be kind of a triangle shape. Basically, they're the cuts that you would normally do when you're cutting off a skull plate, but smaller and just a little bit more of an angle. So I have my two cuts, but they don't quite meet in the middle yet. The sides are the hardest part to do on a burr-to-burr. In order to get those two angles to meet, I'm going to start cutting slightly from the side. Also, I want to add, when you're using the multi-tool can get kind of hot, so just be careful for your own safety, and also if the skin or the hair gets too hot, you could singe the hair, you could singe the skin, and also it's just not good for the skin to get so hot, so just something to be careful of. If you find that blade getting too warm, just back off and let it cool down, and then go at it again. Right here, I was having a little bit of trouble cutting the skull plate, so I switched the blade on the multi-tool to 90 degrees, and so I'm going to cut it from a different angle. I had to come back to the first cut on the forehead because I missed a spot. And right here, I felt the skull cap give way, and it is finally completely cut off from the rest of the skull. It just took a little bit of wiggling, and now it is totally removed. So now here we have the antlers and the skull plate detached from the skull, but obviously the skull is still within the skin here, and we got to skin the rest out. As you can see, there's quite a bit of neck meat on here, and what you can't see, but I'll show you in a moment, is that there's still a lot of cape left on here, so I'm going to cut that and then just skin this off, kind of like you would if you were skinning out a doe or something like that and you had no incision at all. Let me get started on that part. I'm going to take a paper towel and just put it in this hole here, so that fluids aren't leaking anymore. There's like a lot of brain matter and stuff like that. Anyway, almost done. This is just going to be a regular wall shoulder mount, so I'm just cutting off the excess skin here. There's no reason to send the whole thing to the tannery because I'm not going to use it. And now this deer is completely skinned. And so this is what it's supposed to look like when you do a burr-to-burr incision. It just looks like a normal cape, except this is your only incision. And so like I said, besides that incision, everything else is completely the same. The skull cap is cut the same way as you normally would if you were just cutting a regular incision, and everything else is completely the same. I don't know if any of y'all noticed, but this deer had like a pretty severe overbite, so I'm gonna have to deal with that later, but it's just kind of interesting. And there you have it. That's how you do a burr-to-burr incision on a deer. Please remember, this is just how I do it, and it's what works for me, and I know it works for me. There are tons of different methods out there, so if you want to mix it up, try different ones, absolutely go for it. This is not the be-all, end-all method. If you like this video or if it helped you at all, please like this video and subscribe if you feel like it. But thank you so much for watching.